I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are stepping right out of your front door and walking into a vast, entirely invisible ocean.
Oh, I love this visual. It's so accurate.
Right, because you can't see the currents, you can't, touch the waves, and you definitely can't smell the water. But this ocean is washing over you, passing right through you, and profoundly influencing your biology every single second of your life.
Yeah, we are quite literally submerged in it. I mean, we evolved in this ocean, but over the last 100 years or so, we've started to engineer our own really violent currents within it.
Exactly. We're talking about the electromagnetic spectrum. It is everywhere. And today, our mission for this deep dive is to map out this invisible ocean.
And we're going to do that by taking a highly structured look at the radiation and public health chapter from the Oxford textbook of global public health.
Yeah, and let's set some ground rules right off the bat. This isn't just us reading a textbook summary to you. This is a companion guide. So if you're a medical student, a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or, a practicing clinician, we are here to help you build the frameworks and really strengthen your clinical reasoning as you actively read this chapter.
Because we have to move way beyond just raw memorization here. The goal is to build a durable conceptual framework that you can apply to any environmental health challenge.
Okay, so what does that framework actually look like?
Well, the analytical spine we're using today follows a very distinct pathway. It goes from risk, leading to exposure, which leads to an outcome, which then necessitates an intervention, and ultimately results in system impact.
Risk, exposure, outcome, intervention, system impact. Got it.
Right. And public health, especially when we're regulating radiation, is basically forced to govern the invisible. So we often have to act based on probabilistic models rather than just human perception.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to track radiation from its absolute lowest, most sluggish frequencies, the deep, silent currents of our ocean, all the way up to the terrifyingly high-energy, DNA-shattering particles.
The microscopic high-pressure water jets, keeping with your metaphor.
That's exactly. And we'll examine how public health policies actually intervene and protect us at every single depth.
But to navigate that, we first have to understand the major divide in the MAC. The spectrum is huge, but biologically, it's split by one crucial threshold.
You mean non-ionizing versus ionizing radiation?
Exactly. That is the foundational divide.
Right. So if we keep our ocean metaphor going, the deep, slow currents might push you around. They might even, heat you up, but they don't fundamentally change what you're made of. That's non-ionizing.
Yeah. Perfect way to think about it.
But at the extreme end of the spectrum, the energy is vibrating so incredibly fast that the water acts like a diamond-tipped pressure washer. It physically strips electrons away from the atoms in your cellular DNA.
Which is a brilliant biophysical picture. That is ionizing radiation. It exists at frequencies above roughly 10 to the power of 20 hertz.
And everything below that violent threshold is non-ionizing.
Right. Non-ionizing occupies the vast real estate below that, from absolute zero up to about 300 gigahertz.
Yeah.
But through a public health lens, our focus isn't just about how much physical energy the wave carries.
Because it's a more complex calculation, right? Like hazard multiplied by exposure prevalence.
Exactly. It's a massive balancing act.
So as a public health practitioner, I might be equally worried about a technology with a tiny individual risk, but that exposes 5 billion people globally, as I am about an occupational hazard that carries a huge individual risk, but only exposes, say, 100 workers.
Precisely. You balance population exposure prevalence against occupational high exposure. If something is ubiquitous like mobile phones, even a fraction of a percent increase in a disease translates to a massive systemic burden.
It becomes a global health priority, demanding intense surveillance.
Right, even if the underlying biophysics suggests the individual hazard is super low.
Okay, so let's begin our descent into this ocean. We're starting at the very bottom. Absolute zero. 0 hertz. The static fields.
Yeah, 0 hertz dictates that the field is constant in time. It's entirely stationary. The electric and magnetic fields don't oscillate or reverse direction.
And we measure these magnetic fields in Teslas, right? Or Gauss.
Exactly. 1 Tesla is 10,000 Gauss.
And we all live in a static magnetic field continuously because the Earth generates one.
We do. The Earth's molten iron core creates a natural geomagnetic field. But biophysically, it's incredibly weak, peaking at about 70 microtesla at the poles.
Man-made sources, though, are a completely different story. The textbook points out direct current trams, maglev trains, which can hit about 1 Tesla on the rails, and of course, MRI machines.
Right, the most common high-exposure environment for clinicians.
Routine clinical MRIs are what, between zero point 0.2 and 3 Tesla, and research scanners are pushing 10 Tesla?
Yeah, and this is exactly where theoretical physics just smashes into human biology and occupational health.
Well, let me pause you there because I need to establish the mechanism. If the frequency is absolute zero, nothing is oscillating, how does this actually affect our biology?
I know, intuitively it feels like it shouldn't matter at all.
Right, if I'm standing still in a static field, no waves are transferring energy to me.
But the biophysical mechanisms are actually profound. They fall into 3 categories: magnetic induction, magnetomechanical interactions, and electronic interactions. The key is that while the field is static, you are not.
Ah, because I'm a complex matrix of moving electrical charges. Blood flowing, ions pumping, action potentials firing.
Exactly. Let's take magnetic induction. Faraday's law says that moving a conductive fluid like your heavily ionic blood through a static magnetic field induces an electrical current.
Wow, so just my blood pumping creates a current.
Yeah, in a massive field like an MRI bore, the blood flowing through your aortic arch generates a small but measurable voltage. It's actually enough to briefly distort an ECG reading.
That's wild. It creates a flow potential that elevates the T wave. But what about the magnetomechanical stuff? Are the fields literally pulling on my cells?
They're orienting them. Many biological molecules have a preferred physical orientation in the strong magnetic field. It's called diamagnetic anisotropy.
Okay, so what happens if you put a human in a 4 Tesla field?
The field interacts with those structures in the vestibular system of the inner ear. The Lorentz forces act on the ionic currents in the endolymph fluid.
Meaning the magnetic field is physically altering my balance mechanisms.
Yes. The textbook notes this causes clear, aversive vestibular responses, profound vertigo, nausea, a metallic taste in the mouth.
Oh, this makes perfect clinical sense. When you observe an MRI suite, the techs move the patient table incredibly slowly.
Exactly. If they move a patient rapidly through the spatial gradient of that static field, they cross the magnetic flux lines too fast, and boom, you induce those massive vestibular currents.
The threshold is moving through a gradient of about 1 Tesla per second, right?
Right, and that is a direct, observable, deterministic biological effect. But public health always circles back to chronic exposure in oncology.
Which brings us to the epidemiological data on chronic static fields in cancer. And honestly, the textbook paints a really frustrating picture here.
It's an area riddled with unresolved data. The primary cohorts we studied are heavy industrial workers, specifically in aluminum smelters, using massive direct current equipment.
But smelters are an epidemiological nightmare for isolating variables. Let's apply our framework. We want to link the exposure, the static field, to the outcome cancer.
Right, and to do that reliably, you absolutely have to control for confounding variables.
But a worker in a smelter is inhaling coal tar pitch, sulfur oxides, fluoride dust, heavy metals. If you see a spike in lung cancer, pinning it specifically on the magnetic field is just mathematically perilous.
The epidemiology is just way too noisy. Plus, animal models exposed to lifetime static fields show zero increased incidence of malignancy.
So we have no isolated epidemiological proof and no biophysical mechanism for cancer at 0 Hertz.
No.
Which creates a fascinating regulatory headache. If the cancer risk is unproven, but the transient risks like the vertigo are real, how do groups like ICNIRP set legal exposure limits?
They rely on risk-benefit analysis, leading to tiered governance. For the general public, ICNIRP recommends a strict continuous exposure limit of 400 millitesla.
Because there's a wide safety margin, and the public gets no direct benefit from walking through an industrial magnetic field.
Right, but the clinical setting is a totally different paradigm. For an MRI patient, ICNIRP allows up to 4 Tesla in normal mode and up to 8 Tesla in specialized environments.
Because the clinical justification completely alters the threshold. Finding a glioblastoma or an ischemic stroke offers a massive immediate benefit that eclipses the transient risks.
That is the essence of clinical public health policy. You govern hazards in the context of utility.
Okay, let's move slightly up the spectrum. We're leaving 0 Hertz and entering the extremely low frequency, or ELF band.
Now we're operating at 50 to 60 hertz.
The heartbeat of modern civilization. The exact frequency of the global power grid. Power lines, substations, the wiring in your clinic walls.
Right. And to assess exposure, we have to split the ELF field into 2 components. First, the electric field, measured in volts per meter.
Which is easily shielded, right? Your skin or a house wall blocks it effectively.
Exactly. But the magnetic component, measured in microtesla, is highly penetrating. It passes through walls and tissue with almost no attenuation.
If you live near a high voltage line, that 50 hertz magnetic field is sweeping through your body 50 times a second.
Yeah. Typical residential exposure is around zero point 0.1 microtesla. Occupational can exceed 3 microtesla. But it's not the workers that have driven public health anxiety here.
No, it's the pediatric data. We have to dissect the childhood leukemia dilemma. It's such a fascinating tension in the text.
It really represents the most intractable friction point in modern environmental epidemiology.
Let me summarize the data. In the year 2000, two massive pooled analyses looked at kids living near power lines. Their conclusion was a statistically significant twofold increase in the relative risk of childhood leukemia for exposures above 0.3 or 0.4 microtesla.
And a twofold increase in pediatric oncology is a massive alarm bell. But this raises an important question. Why didn't we just bury every power line on Earth?
Because we have to apply systems thinking. Epidemiology is just one pillar. The other is biological plausibility.
And the biophysics of a 50 hertz field just do not support oncogenesis. The photon energy is millions of times too weak to break a DNA bond.
It can't cause ionization. It doesn't carry thermal energy to heat tissue. And massive lifetime animal studies show no link to leukemia.
None at all.
Yeah.
So we have this paradoxical friction. Epidemiology screening association and biophysics screaming impossible.
So as an investigator, where do you look for the error?
You meticulously deconstruct the methodology for systemic bias. Childhood leukemia is rare, so you need massive sample sizes. And even microscopic flaws can artificially inflate a correlation.
The textbook highlights a heavily influential study from Brazil. Let's break down how selection bias infiltrates a case control study like that.
Think about the logistics. You identify a case, a child with leukemia, and control a healthy child. You call both parents to ask if a tech can measure their home's magnetic fields.
The psychology there is completely asymmetrical. If my child was just diagnosed, I'm desperate for a cause. I will absolutely consent to testing.
Right. But the parent of the healthy control, they're busy, they see no benefit, it sounds intrusive, they decline.
So control group participation plummets.
And the controls who do participate aren't a random sample. They often have higher socioeconomic status, live in newer housing, further away from the dense, older power grids that generate the highest field.
Oh, wow. So you artificially create a statistical gap in exposure between the sick kids and the healthy kids.
It creates a complete phantom correlation. And then you have the nightmare of exposure assessment.
Yeah.
How do you quantify a child's exposure 3 years prior to diagnosis?
You can't. It's a non-memorable exposure. It's invisible and silent.
Early studies just used wire codes, estimating exposure based on the thickness of power lines visible from the street.
Which totally ignores the house's internal wiring, electric blankets, or the time the kid spends at school.
And later studies used 24-hour dosimeters, but that's just a snapshot of current exposure, not historical exposure during the hypothetical period of oncogenesis.
So, synthesizing this, we have a small twofold association, heavily compromised by selection bias and terrible exposure assessment, with zero biological mechanism.
Yep.
Yet, IIRC still classified ELF magnetic fields as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. How did they justify that?
Semantic definitions. Group 2B doesn't mean we have proof. It's a specific category of scientific uncertainty. The epidemiological signal was just too consistent to definitively mathematically rule out a hazard.
It's an admission of residual doubt. But how do you govern that? You can't shut down the global power grid.
You implement low-cost precautionary measures, upstream engineering standards for new infrastructure.
It's like zoning a new school so the high voltage lines aren't right over the playground.
It's exactly. Or designing consumer appliances to phase cancel stray magnetic fields. It's quiet, incremental action that respects the uncertainty without causing panic.
Masterclass in pragmatic governance. Okay, moving up the spectrum. We pass into the intermediate frequency, or IF band.
Spanning roughly 300 hertz to 10 megahertz.
The text calls this a data desert, but we use it constantly. Industrial induction heaters, anti-theft tags at the mall, RFID security badges.
And the reason it's a desert perfectly illustrates how research funding works. Grants go to proven catastrophic mechanisms like ionizing radiation or massive public anxiety like cell phones.
And IF has neither. People aren't terrified of their office keycard.
So there's an absolute dearth of dedicated biological studies on IF, but occupational agencies still have to provide safe exposure limits.
How do they invent a limit without biological data?
Interpolation. It's an educated mathematical bridge. They plot the known data points from ELF below it and RF above it and draw a curve connecting them through the IF zone.
Guessing that the effects smoothly transition from nerve stimulation to thermal heating.
Right. It's a logical extrapolation, but as the textbook cautions, it's a temporary bridge. With RFID tagging exploding globally, we urgently need dedicated IF toxicological research.
From the unknown, we step into the most hotly debated band of the 21st century. Radiofrequency, or RF radiation.
200 kilohertz up to roughly 2,500 megahertz and into the millimeter waves.
TV towers, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the over 5 billion mobile phones globally. We need to establish a firm dosimetric differentiation here. Localized versus whole body exposure.
This is critical for addressing patient anxiety. Think about geometry. A phone pressed to your ear delivers localized concentrated RF absorption to your superficial head tissues.
Right, but walking past a civil tower.
The antenna is distant. The energy disperses via the inverse square law. You get a whole body exposure, but the energy density is infinitesimally small. Median indoor power density is like 0.0005 milliwatts per square meter.
Which is a crazy clinical paradox. People are terrified of cell towers in their neighborhoods, protests, petitions, but the device sitting in their pocket is a vastly larger source of personal exposure.
What's fascinating here is that public health operates at the intersection of biology and human psychology. Base station anxiety is driven by a lack of personal agency. It's involuntary risk.
The control element. When you buy a phone, you voluntarily assume a theoretical risk for an immediate benefit: global communication.
Exactly. A cell tower is imposed on a community. You don't control it, you can't turn it off, and you perceive no immediate benefit from that specific tower.
We accept massive risks when we drive a car because we're in control, but reject microscopic risks when we feel like passengers.
It's a fundamental risk heuristic.
So what's the actual biological mechanism when that RF wave penetrates my temporal lobe?
The universally established mechanism across all major scientific bodies is thermal interaction, tissue heating.
How does an invisible radio wave create heat in my brain?
Human tissue is mostly water. Water molecules are electrical dipoles, positive on one end, negative on the other. When the oscillating RF field hits them, it forces them to rapidly rotate back and forth.
Creating molecular friction.
Precisely. Billions of molecules, oscillating millions of times a second, generate sensible heat. It's how a microwave works, just at a vastly lower power. Your phone is gently warming the tissue next to the antenna.
But the public panic isn't about warm ears. It's about gliomas and acoustic neuromas. And IRRC classified RF as Group 2B as well.
Based on limited epidemiological evidence. And if the leukemia studies were hard to interpret, the cell phone and glioma studies are a methodological nightmare of unprecedented proportions.
Why? Just the ubiquity of it.
Ubiquity, rapidly evolving tech, and profound recall bias. The Interphone study across 13 countries is a prime example.
How do you even gather that data? You find a patient with a glioma and ask them to quantify their phone used over the last decade.
Yes.
I couldn't accurately tell you how many minutes I was on the phone last Tuesday, let alone 5 years ago.
Now compound that with a highly lethal brain tumor that might be causing cognitive deficits.
Yeah.
You're asking for granular historical behavior.
Including laterality, which year they used?
And that's where recall bias becomes toxic. Humans desperately need causality for a catastrophic diagnosis. If you have a left-sided tumor, you will obsessively search your memory, and you are highly prone to unconsciously overreport that you held the phone to your left ear.
It's a psychologically driven distortion, and the exposure itself is a moving target.
Hyperdynamic. Early studies used 1G and 2G analog networks. Those handsets were inefficient and transmitted at high power, sometimes 1 or 2 watts.
But a modern 4G or 5G smartphone uses adaptive power control. It only transmits at the minimum power needed. It might be a fraction of a milliwatt.
So correlating a tumor today with a cumulative hours on the phone metric that spans 3 generations of totally different tech is scientifically perilous.
Plus, our behavior changed. We text, use earbuds, speakerphone. The localized dose to the head has plummeted naturally.
So we have a biologically implausible mechanism for cancer. RF doesn't break DNA with deeply flawed epidemiology showing a weak association for a technology used by everyone. How do you govern?
The textbook leans on the precautionary principle. Brain tumors have decades-long latency periods, and we have a generation of kids exposed since birth.
So public health recommends simple, low-effort behavioral interventions to reduce localized exposure.
Exploiting the inverse square law.
Exactly. Use a hands-free headset or speakerphone. Moving the antenna from 0 millimeters from your skull to 30 centimeters away reduces the localized brain absorption to near zero.
It's virtually zero cost and sidesteps the whole debate.
Brilliant. Okay, crossing the threshold again.
Liam.
We are leaving radiofrequency and entering infrared radiation, or IR. We're getting into raw, sensible heat now.
IR ranges from 780 nanometers down to 1 millimeter, subdivided into IRA, IRB, and far-infrared IRC. The difference is their optical penetration depth.
And the mechanism of harm here is refreshingly simple.
Strictly thermal injury. The IR is absorbed by skin or eye molecules, increasing kinetic energy, manifesting as heat. If the intensity exceeds the tissue's blood flow cooling capacity, you get a thermal burn.
The textbook mentions erythema abygne, redness from fire. Yeah, historically seen in people sitting too close to peat fires or coal stoves all winter. The chronic low-level IR causes vasodilation and hemosiderin deposition, leaving a permanent mottled, net-like hyperpigmentation.
Today we see it when someone rests a hot laptop on their bare legs for 8 hours. But the big occupational focus is the glassworker's cataract.
A perfect example of specific wavelengths interacting with specialized anatomy. A glassblower or foundry worker stares into a furnace, radiating immense IR energy.
Walk us through the protein kinetics. How does radiant heat cause a cataract?
The short-wavelength IRA strikes the front of the eye and is heavily absorbed by the cornea and aqueous humor, converting to heat.
And the front of the eye doesn't have rapid blood flow to cool it down.
Exactly. So the heat is conducted deeper, directly to the crystalline lens.
Which is a highly structured sac of transparent crystalline proteins.
And proteins hate thermal stress. The chronic conductive heat causes the crystalline proteins to denature. They lose their spatial folding and clump together. Like frying an egg, the transparent protein turns opaque white.
That's the cataract. So what's the occupational intervention?
Upstream engineering.
Yeah.
You mandate IR attenuating protective eyewear that specifically reflects or absorbs IRA wavelengths before they hit the cornea.
Quick pivot before we leave IR. Far infrared saunas. The wellness industry claims IRC, deep penetrating heat, cures obesity, chronic fatigue, everything. What's the clinical reality?
The evidence is decidedly mixed. First, far IR actually penetrates less deeply than near IR. It's very superficial absorption.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's highly efficient at triggering thermoregulation, so you sweat more at a lower ambient air temp than a finished sauna.
But does it cure disease?
There's moderate evidence it acts as passive cardiovascular exercise. The vasodilation can acutely lower blood pressure and help stable congestive heart failure patients.
But the weight loss and detox claims?
The epidemiology is incredibly weak.
Right.
We have to separate established thermoregulation from unsubstantiated marketing hype.
Vital distinction. All right, moving past the visible light band, we reach a profound turning point. The wavelengths are getting shorter, frequency is increasing. We are hitting currents energetic enough to directly shatter genetic code without heating. Ultraviolet radiation.
UV is categorized into UVA, UVB, and UVC.
Think of a sunny day at the beach. The sun is a fusion reactor blasting all 3 bands, but the stratospheric ozone layer completely filters out the lethal UVC. So what hits our skin is 95% UVA and 5% UVB.
And we need a detailed pathology deep dive here to understand oncogenesis.
Walk me through exactly what that 5% UVB does to my skin cells when I get a sunburn.
UVB is highly energetic. It's absorbed by the epidermis. When a UVB photon strikes the nucleus of a keratinocyte, it can directly interact with the DNA. It causes 2 adjacent pyrimidine bases, like 2 thymines on the same strand, to break their normal bonds and covalently bond to each other.
It fuses 2 rungs of the ladder together on the same side, creating a kink.
A cyclobutane pyrimidine dimer, a direct structural lesion.
But our bodies can repair that, right? The nucleotide excision repair pathway.
Normally, yes. Enzymes snip out the damaged dimer and synthesize a fresh sequence. But an acute sunburn induces millions of these dimers simultaneously. You overwhelm the repair kinetics.
So if the cell divides before it's fixed, it introduces a permanent mutation.
Exactly. The polymerase enzyme basically guesses the bases. If that mutation knocks out a tumor suppressor gene like P53, that cell starts dividing uncontrollably. That is the initiating step for basal cell carcinoma or squamous cell carcinoma.
Okay, that's the 5% UVB. What about the 95% UVA flood? It's less energetic, so no direct kinks.
Not directly, but UVA is far more insidious. It penetrates much deeper into the dermal layer. It excites endogenous chromophores, transferring energy to oxygen, creating reactive oxygen species.
Free radicals.
Right. A localized storm of oxidative stress that denatures collagen and elastin, causing photoaging and, critically, causes oxidative lesions in the DNA.
So UVA uses chemical shrapnel, while UVB uses direct photon energy.
And they work synergistically. The combined assault selectively depletes Langerhans cells in the epidermis, suppressing the local immune response.
It blinds the immune system from seeing the precancerous cells that just mutated.
Precisely. This synergistic pathway leads to malignant melanoma, the most lethal skin cancer.
Brutal pathology. So how do we intervene? We can't turn off the sun.
Environmental surveillance and behavioral modification. The Global Solar UV Index is a premier example.
It's like an early warning radar. It integrates sun angle, ozone thickness, and cloud cover to trigger interventions like seeking shade, hats, and sunscreen.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, behavioral recommendations are the weakest interventions. People fail to make perfect choices.
Which is why public health bypasses behavior and uses legislation for severe hazards, like commercial sunbeds.
The data on sunbeds became undeniable. They blast the user with concentrated UVA and some UVB. Early life use causes a massive spike in relative risk for all three cutaneous malignancies.
So regulators didn't just put up warning signs.
They used legal prohibition. Many countries and U.S. states strictly banned commercial sunbeds for anyone under 18. Definitive upstream protective governance.
Before we move on, the vitamin D debate. Patients always ask, doesn't UV synthesize vitamin D? Shouldn't we get some unprotected sun?
UVB does synthesize vitamin D, but public health relies on population-level risk-benefit analysis. The IIRC conducted an exhaustive review in 2008.
And the consensus.
The theoretical benefits of unprotected UV for vitamin D synthesis simply do not mathematically outweigh the universally established carcinogenic harms. You can get optimal vitamin D through cheap oral supplementation without mutating your epidermal DNA.
Perfect risk-benefit calculation. Okay, we've reached the extreme end of the keyboard, the final threshold. Ionizing radiation.
Energy so high it forcibly ejects an electron from its orbit, leaving behind an ion and a free radical. X-rays, gamma rays, alpha particles, beta particles.
I need to define the dosimetry metrics here. It gets confusing. Gray versus sievert.
The bedrock of radiological protection. Let's start with absorbed dose, measured in grays.
1 gray is 1 joule of radiation energy deposited into 1 kilogram of mass.
A purely physical metric. It tells you nothing about the biological consequence.
I use an analogy for this. If I throw a baseball at a glass window with a specific kinetic energy, it punches a clean hole. That's the absorbed dose. If I take a 16-pound bowling ball and throw it with the exact same total kinetic energy, the physical energy, the gray, is identical.
But the biological or structural damage is vastly different. The bowling ball destroys the entire window frame.
Right.
That's the perfect way to visualize a gamma ray versus an alpha particle. An alpha particle is massive, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. It dumps all its energy in a microscopic, dense track, shredding DNA.
The bowling ball.
Yes. A gamma ray is the baseball, causing sparse ionization. So we convert absorbed dose to equivalent dose, measured in sieverts.
By multiplying it by a radiation weighting factor.
An alpha particle has a weighting factor of 20. A gamma ray is 1. So 1 gray of alpha radiation equals an equivalent dose of 20 sieverts, 20 times more biologically destructive.
But there's a third metric. Effective dose, also measured in sieverts. Why?
Because anatomy isn't homogeneous. An X-ray to the bicep has minimal oncological consequence. But that same X-ray to the thyroid or bone marrow is highly dangerous because of rapidly dividing stem cells.
So effective dose factors in the specific organ being hit using a tissue weighting factor.
Exactly. It sums up all organ exposures to give one comprehensive number representing the total probabilistic risk of a fatal cancer.
Okay, so where is the population encountering this?
Mostly natural background sources. The primary culprit is radon gas.
An alpha emitter.
Decay product of natural uranium. It seeps into basements, you inhale it, it decays in your lungs, firing those bowling ball alpha particles into your respiratory epithelium.
The textbook says prolonged residential radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer globally, right behind smoking.
It's a massive crisis. But public health is highly focused on what we can control. Medical exposures.
The U.S. average annual per capita medical radiation dose jumped from 0.53 millisieverts in the 80s to over 3.0 millisieverts by 2006, a 6-fold increase.
Driven almost entirely by CT scans.
Are we overdiagnosing our way into an iatrogenic cancer epidemic?
To answer that, we must differentiate between deterministic and stochastic effects.
Let's do deterministic first.
Tissue reactions. Acute consequences of massive cellular slaughter. There is a definitive dose threshold. Below it, nothing happens. Cross it, the effect is guaranteed, and severity increases with dose.
Like acute radiation syndrome at Chernobyl or radiation cataracts?
Right, but a diagnostic CT scan does not hit that threshold. Medical imaging is entirely about stochastic effects.
Random, probabilistic effects.
Long-term consequences of sublethal DNA damage. A mutated cell replicates and decades later manifests as a tumor. And the rule is absolutely no threshold.
The linear no threshold or LNT model.
Any exposure, even one photon, carries a non-zero probability of cancer. The probability increases linearly with dose, but the severity does not.
So a lung cancer caused by a low-dose CT scan is just as lethal as one caused by a massive dose. The dose just changes the roll of the dice.
Exactly, a binary event.
But how do we empirically prove the LNT model at low doses?
The Lifespan Study, or LSS. The survivors of the atomic bombings in Japan. Over 93,000 survivors tracked since 1950.
Unparalleled data set.
They retroactively calculated precise, individualized doses based on distance and shielding. It proved the linear relationship and critically proved that age at exposure dictates risk.
Because children are rapidly growing, faster mitosis gives the mutation a chance to replicate before it's repaired.
And they have a longer lifespan for the cancer to manifest.
So back to the question, are we risking cancer with unnecessary pediatric CT scans?
Epidemiologically, yes. Which is why policy enforces 3 rigid pillars of radiological protection. Pillar 1, justification.
The diagnostic benefit must unequivocally offset the stochastic risk. You don't CT a toddler for a minor head bump.
Pillar 2, optimization, the LERA principle as low as reasonably achievable.
Tune the equipment to the lowest possible dose for a usable image. Don't use adult settings on kids.
Pillar 3, dose limits. 1 millisievert per year for the public, 20 millisieverts for occupational workers.
But medical patients are exempt from limits, right?
Because their exposure is governed entirely by justification and optimization.
It's a beautifully logical framework. We've traversed the whole ocean, and it leaves me with a profound paradox.
What's that?
We just spent an hour detailing how dangerous ionizing radiation is, how it breaks DNA and causes cancer. Yet those exact same high-energy photons are our most powerful tools in modern oncology to cure tumors. The radiation can initiate the exact disease it's engineered to treat.
That is the ultimate takeaway. The line between poison and cure is dosimetric precision and public health governance. Risk is a function of dose, duration, and control.
Well said. To ensure these frameworks are anchored, my co-host is going to deliver 5 rapid, single best answer prompts. Take a second to answer them yourself.
Let's begin. Prompt 1. Which specific dosimetric metric mathematically accounts for both the physical type of ionizing radiation and the specific radiosensitivity of the irradiated organ? Answer. The effective dose, measured in sieverts. Revisit the ionizing radiation definition section if needed. Prompt 2. What is the sole primary universally established biophysical mechanism of damage for radiofrequency radiation penetrating human tissue? Answer. Thermal interaction, specifically tissue heating. Review the radiofrequency health effects section. Prompt 3. An acute biological effect of ionizing radiation that requires a definitive dose threshold and whose clinical severity increases as dose increases is categorized as what? Answer. A deterministic effect or a tissue reaction. Revisit the ionizing radiation health effects section. Prompt 4. Why is childhood exposure to solar UV radiation considered a significantly higher risk factor for long-term melanoma development compared to equivalent adult exposure? Answer. Juvenile anatomy allows increased UV transmission, and rapid pediatric cellular division combined with a longer lifespan provides massive opportunity for mutations to replicate. Revisit the ultraviolet health effects section. Prompt 5. According to the LNT model, what is the exact mathematical relationship between low doses of ionizing radiation and the risk of developing a stochastic effect? Answer. The probabilistic risk of suffering non-lethal carcinogenic DNA damage is directly and linearly proportional to the received dose, with no safe threshold. Revisit the ionizing radiation policy section.
Outstanding. Next time you step outside, take a moment to appreciate the sheer complexity of that vast, invisible ocean you're wading through. It is unseen, but thanks to epidemiology and policy, it is far from ungoverned. Here are the details of this episode.
Radiation, byline. Invisible energy, visible consequences, understanding radiation exposure, risk, and regulation in public health. Episode description. In this episode, Medlock Holmes steps into a realm that cannot be seen, touched, or smelled, yet profoundly influences human health. Radiation. In this episode, Medlock Holmes steps into a realm that cannot be seen, touched, or smelled, yet profoundly influences human health. We begin with the electromagnetic spectrum, distinguishing between ionizing radiation X-rays, gamma rays, radioactive particles, and non-ionizing radiation, ultraviolet, infrared, radiofrequency, and extremely low-frequency fields. Holmes explains how energy level determines biological impact, from DNA damage to thermal effects. The episode explores sources of exposure. The episode explores sources of exposure. Occupational exposures. The episode explores sources of exposure. Occupational exposures. The episode explores sources of exposure. Nuclear energy. The episode explores sources of exposure. Consumer technologies and telecommunications. The episode explores sources of exposure. Holmes carefully distinguishes established risks from areas of ongoing scientific uncertainty. Ionizing radiation is clearly linked to cancer and genetic damage. Ultraviolet radiation is associated with skin cancer and cataract. For other exposures, such as extremely low-frequency fields or radiofrequency radiation, evidence remains debated and evolving. The episode explores sources of exposure. We examine dose-response relationships, latency periods, occupational cohort studies, and international exposure guidelines. Holmes emphasizes risk assessment, precautionary principles, and the balance between technological benefit and health protection. The episode explores sources of exposure. Radiation reminds us that risk is not always visible. Public health must often act based on probability rather than perception. The episode explores sources of exposure. Key takeaways. The episode explores sources of exposure. Ionizing radiation can damage DNA and increase cancer risk. The episode explores sources of exposure. Non-ionizing radiation has varying biological effects depending on frequency and intensity. The episode explores sources of exposure.
Medical exposures require risk-benefit balancing. The episode explores sources of exposure. Occupational environmental exposures must be regulated. The episode explores sources of exposure. Dose and duration determine risk magnitude. The episode explores sources of exposure. Uncertainty must be communicated transparently. The episode explores sources of exposure. Radiation policy integrates science, technology, and precaution.